Hey Julie, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Anything?
Yes, Community Association is live now.
Hi everybody, we just have a few minutes before we're going to start up here at 5:30, so if you can hear me okay, just put a note in the comments so I know everything's good to go, and we'll get going as soon as everyone's online. How's it looking over there?
She sees you and hears you. It seems like there's a delay, but I think it does that on purpose. There's 6 people on, so you're good.
Okay, cool. Alrighty.
Coming through loud and clear, Karen says.
Perfect. Just give it a few more minutes for some people to get on. Some people are very punctual and like to be on there right at 5:30, so we'll give them a few minutes to get on live here. I feel like we should have background music.
She
Start
doesn't
singing.
tell jokes or something.
You don't want me to tell jokes, trust me. It's not going to happen. I should duck out of screen. Duck back into screen. All right. Are there any comments so far I need to know about? No, just Karen. Hi, Karen.
We've got 14 people so far.
Oh, 14 people. Oh, I can see it up there. There's a little number 14 up there.
Yeah.
Very sweet.
And people are coming early, so that's a good sign.
Welcome all you early people. I do appreciate that. I'm always early myself, so it's always nice to know you're there. We just got another couple of minutes here until 5:30. I'll give them till 5:31 and then we'll get going and we can start off this. Nope, no, I've only got 12 people. 2 people disappeared. I don't know what happened to them. Turn my phone off so it doesn't bother us. All right, 2 more minutes here and we will get going. Welcome to everyone who's already online. Thank you for being early.
Another minute or 2.
Yeah, I'll give them another couple minutes. It's been 3 minutes and 42 seconds I've been sitting here, you know.
Musin says, hey there, what's up?
What's up? The ceiling, the sky, the blue sky right now. It was pouring with rain yesterday, but it's very pleasant at the moment, so the plants will be liking that.
Cullen has joined us as well.
Oh, hello, Diana Cullen. Some of the warm weather things may not relate to Smithers, British Columbia, but I'm sure you can still get something out of it. All right, we've got 23 people on now. We'll just give it 1 more minute, then we'll get started. The first bit's a bit of housekeeping anyway, so if people join in later on, they can probably catch up pretty easily. Just going to turn this heater off so I don't overheat. All right, that's better. All right. How are we looking?
Looking great. 23 people. Give it another minute or 2. I know you like to start right on time.
I do like to start right on time, and it's exactly 5:30.
Maybe 5:31, 5:32, just to let
5:32. I don't know. 5:31. I might allow. 5:32. No, that's unacceptable. I'll play with my screen in the interim so that I can give me something to do, distract myself. How about that? Whoop, there I am. It's 5:31 now. I think that's it.
Up to you.
All right, I'm going to get started. As I said, if anyone who comes in late, they can probably catch up pretty easily. I'll be doing recaps of each section anyway, so it shouldn't be that hard to catch up. So hello to all 27 of you, and welcome to Backyard Garden Basics. My name's Louise, and I'm the owner-operator of Yard to Plate, which is an urban farming consultancy here in Victoria, British Columbia. I would first like to acknowledge that we live and work on unceded Indigenous territories here in Victoria, specifically that of two of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations. Right now, it seems more important to me than ever to acknowledge these peoples, and their knowledge are going to be vital moving forward if we have any hope of restoring even small parts of this earth that we live on. And growing even a portion of your own food is a great start with that restoration effort. The knowledge these elders of these nations have as to what plants to grow and how they heal is something I would encourage everyone to look into, even if it's only because they love camas flowers and want to see more of them every spring. They're one of my favorites. As another point of housekeeping, I have Linda here monitoring the comments. So if you have any questions as we're going along, you don't have to wait for me to ask, are there any questions? You can just pop them in there. I also tend to speak rather quickly when I get excited, and I'm excited about gardening, and I have a funny accent. So if that is a problem for you, just pop it in the comments, and Linda will give me the slow down motion, and I'll repeat myself. We also have a few questions that were sent in advance. I will go over them at the end so long as we have time. If any of the questions I don't have time to answer in this, I will be doing a follow-up afterwards as well, both with the Vic West Community Association. See, I'm already getting the slowdown. I can't help it. I'm excited. But I'll do a follow-up afterwards. So don't worry if your question's in there. I will do everything I can to get that answered for you. So there's a quick overview of what we're going to try and cover this afternoon. First section is just briefly my history, my philosophy of growing food, and this should only take about 5 minutes. Section 2 is the main part. I'm going to go over what I walk people through when I go out and to help them start growing their own food. It's all the considerations you want to think about before starting out with your garden. That all being said, let's get down to it. Am I doing good? Am I slow enough? Okay, great. So my history. I've been gardening about 15 years. I started out with a 4x4 plot in a community garden in Vancouver, which was actually my partner's, and I kind of stole because that's kind of what I do. And then from there, I got so fascinated that I started volunteering with the UBC Urban Farmer Program. Once I quit my corporate job, I completed a practicum in sustainable agriculture up there, and I also attained my organic master gardener certification. After that, I worked for the YWCA in Vancouver, running their rooftop garden, where we annually produce between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds of fresh produce for residents of one of their transition houses in the downtown east side of Vancouver. About 18 months ago, we moved to Victoria, and I now live in Vic West. I want to say up front that I have met a great many people in the last 15 years, all of whom know a lot more than me. In my experience, most people seem to wind up specializing in certain plants. One guy grew the best wild arugula I have ever tasted, but he knew nothing about carrots. He destroyed them every time he tried. Another one was amazing at fruit trees and hopeless at leafy greens. Personally, I can't grow zucchini. I don't know why. I've tried in 4 different places. It's not the soil. It's entirely me. But my garlic is pretty amazing, even if I do say so myself. If you go onto any one of 20 gardening forums in Facebook and ask a simple question like, how do I seed my tomatoes? You'll get 15 answers from 20 different people. So what I'm going to share with you today is purely my experience. I'm not saying there aren't other ways to do things, and maybe even better ways to do things, but the main thing I've learned in the last decade is that no one knows everything. And sometimes things will just die, and you will not know why. If you keep those 2 points in mind, you can just have fun with it. I heard a comment the other day that gardening is like an act of hope, and I think that's pretty accurate. When I think about me agonizing over my garlic every year, and the joy I feel when it pokes through the snow, I know that that's true. And remember, plants put out hundreds or thousands of seeds to replicate themselves naturally. Getting a 100% success rate is nowhere in their mandate. It's just humans who want that to happen. So the main takeaway from section 1 is try not to stress about it too much. Just try. Doing okay? Sweet. I'm going to check in with her every now and again because I know what I'm like. So the main section, section 2, is what I walk people through when they're starting out. While I was at school, we had to do a final project and create a business plan. For me, the idea was yard to plate. My business plan is basically to coach people to grow their own food. Obviously, this is a little easier if I can come out and check out your space, but through the wonders of video chat, I can do virtual consultations. I've done 2 this week. In Vancouver at the time, CSAs, which are community supported agriculture, were very popular. But people would wind up with, say, a radicchio that they did not know what to do with, or a lot of arugula and they don't like spicy greens. I wanted to help people grow food they actually wanted to eat in space that they had. It isn't really hugely complicated, but there's a lot of information and so many opinions that people get put off. On a very basic level, seeds and plants need something to grow in, some water, some sun, and heat. That's about it. Some require pollination to actually produce fruit, which is probably what you want to eat of them, but some don't. There's a basic starting point: water, sun, heat, and something to grow in. That's pretty much all they need. I know a lot of people get overwhelmed or frustrated when something dies for no good reason. The fact is, there is a good reason, but it's not immediately obvious to you unless you've done eons of work in horticulture, and often there's nothing you could have done about it anyway, like if a hailstorm takes all the buds off one of your fruit trees. So what I wanted to try and help people do is walk through that process and reassure them that even the best gardeners have things go sideways somewhere. The first thing I ask people is, what do you want to eat? My main focus is food production. Some people like growing flowers and ornamentals. That's great. It's not particularly my thing. So if you can't eat it, I'm really not that interested in it. But make a list. You won't necessarily be able to grow everything on it. There'll be restrictions due to space, climate, the amount of time and money you want to put into it, but that's where, in my opinion, you need to start out. For example, there's no point growing kale if you're not going to eat it. Some people just don't like kale. It doesn't matter if you live in Vancouver or Victoria. Kale is not your thing, and no matter how easy it is to grow, there is no point if you don't want to eat it, in my opinion. It takes up a lot of space when it grows to its full form, and it will form a fungus in your soil if you keep planting it in the same spot year over year that could affect something that you ultimately do want to eat. So if you don't want to eat it, do not plant it. Thinking about that question briefly off the top of my head, some things that are pretty easy to grow on a very basic level is kale, honestly, it's one of my favorites, lettuce, radishes, beans, peas, zucchini. There's a lot of things that are very easy to grow, although zucchini I cannot grow. As I said, I don't know why. Garlic and potatoes are amazing if you're patient and have time and space. I would also usually stick in some perennial plants, herbs like rosemary, sage, thyme, always a classic, rhubarb, and asparagus. One of the advanced questions I actually had was, where do I start? What do I start with? And again, that will depend on what you want to eat and how quickly you want to see results. If you want to get some satisfaction of saying, I grew this, and you want a very short-term gratification, go for microgreens. They can be ready to eat in a week from when you stick them in a tray. If you have like a month of patience, go with the lettuce family, or the dreaded kale, or radishes. They all germinate in under a week, so you can see something happening right away, and within 30 days you can be eating something that you've planted. If you have a long-term focus, there's really not too much easier than potatoes or garlic. The seeds that we plant are not actually the seed of the plant at all, but the large, recognizable, easy-to-handle things that we normally eat. And for the most part, you just put them in the ground and forget about them for 5 to 9 months. They're my personal favorites. Another question I often get is perennials versus annuals. So I always think it's good to have a mix, but I'm a very lazy personal gardener. It might have something to do with working in other people's gardens all the time. When I get home, I don't particularly want to spend a lot of time there. Perennials, in case you don't know, are just plants that will grow for over 2 or 3 years. They're great to have as staples. Most of the herbs fall into that category. Fruit trees and bushes, asparagus, rhubarb. Once established, you don't have to think about them. They're there for a number of years, and you just need basic maintenance. One thing I would advise is that if you are putting in perennials, you think about where you're going to put them at the beginning. As unless they're in pots, which is actually a good option for things like mint and rosemary, otherwise they'll go bonkers and take over your yard, it can be very hard to shift them without killing them after they're established. Annuals, on the other hand, are things that you're going to replace every year. They give you a lot of options of varieties you can go with, and if you find one you love, then you can always save seed from it so you can get the next thing next year. But I always like to try a few new things every year just because I can. See what works out. You might find a new favorite. One thing I wanted to make sure mentioning at this point was seed exchanges, especially at the moment with COVID. I know a lot of places are selling out of seeds. And that can be a problem. I do have a resources list I'm going to give out at the end through the VicWest site that will have lists of places that do still have seeds available, but seed exchanges are great. Pretty much every town and suburb has one, and really nobody needs the number of seeds that you get in a pack. I have thrown away more seeds, not because I didn't like the product, but because they literally just weren't viable anymore, than I can poke a stick at. But seed exchanges allow people to say they have 300 lettuce seeds. Well, you might plant 25 in a year and your seeds might last 3 years, but it's still 200 odd seeds you have left over at the end. You can exchange them with somebody else for some cucumbers or some rutabagas or whatever it is that you want. And Facebook is a great resource for this. Seed swaps used to be involving knowing someone or having a mailing list or being involved in a club. Now you just type seed swap near me into Facebook and they'll just pop up for you right there. I know there's a lot of information in here, but never fear, I will recap it at the end, and there is also that info sheet I'm going to send out. So step 1 is nearly complete. You have your list. Now you need to hone it down a bit and think about what's realistic where you live. Mangoes, for example, are not going to flourish in Victoria unless you're building a Versailles-style greenhouse, and then you might have a chance. But if you're not sure if what you want to grow will work here, you could always ask me. Or you can do some research online on any of these forums that I'm talking about. People are more than happy to give you the advice. So you have your list. You have a vague idea of what you want to grow. The next step would be think about what can you grow given the space that you have. So assessing your zone. On forums, you hear a lot of people asking, what zone do we live in? Where are you growing? It's one of the things a lot of like professional gardeners or people will ask, what zone are you in? It's how they'll assess what you can functionally, effectively grow there. We are here in zone 8, which is great. It's the second warmest of the zones. The only thing warmer is somewhere like California. It means you can grow pretty much everything that isn't tropical. But it's just a guideline. It's not a hard and fast rule. For example, you might be in zone 8, but if your neighbor builds an addition that suddenly shades half of your yard, that could impact what you could grow as your sunlight has now been impeded. Honestly, I've never seen a yard or patio that is completely inhospitable to any growing at all. If you have a clay soil that refuses to be amended, or you're on rock like most of my yard is, you can grow in raised beds or buckets or boxes. I've grown lettuce, tomatoes, peas and cucumbers on a southeast facing 10-foot square patio that got about 2 hours of sunlight a day. Our neighbors in Vancouver had an entirely paved yard and they grew the most amazing amounts of squash and beans in old buckets. It was like a forest. It was incredible. So you have the benefit of being in a great place to grow. But there's a few other considerations beyond the zone that you want to think about. Drainage for your soils or containers, because nothing really likes to sit in a puddle for too long. Your specific microclimate. So yes, you're in zone 8, but within that, do you have a protected spot? Is it an exposed area? What's your elevation? North and south facing slopes, walls, all these things. Even a greenhouse can create a microclimate within zone 8. Probably the most important thing that I think is your soil. So that may determine in the short term what you can and can't grow, but most of them, as I said, can be adapted over time by adding compost or sand to fix the composition. Or as I said, you can use raised beds with imported soil. Everything I grew at the YWCA was on a rooftop that had no natural soil at all, and we grew thousands of pounds of food up there. So unless you're competing for the largest pumpkin competition or something like that, most soils are just fine the way they are without a whole lot of amendments to the pH with things like lime and sulfur. Certain plants may be happier with adjusted pH levels, but most can grow fairly happily within the prescribed range. There's if you have something else growing in your yard right now, then chances are some vegetable can grow there as well. With regards to soil, I know there's often a little bit of confusion about what to use, where and when, especially if you're using containers. Usually at a garden store, you'll see 3 different types: seed starting mix, potting soil, and compost. You only want to use seed starting mix if you're starting indoors in very small pots with something like this, these little guys here. They're very light and fluffy. They're actually not soil at all, but they allow seeds to start very quickly. They drain very well, but they also have very little nutritional value. It's also usually sterilized to make sure there's no pathogens in it and to maximize your chances of germination. It's also the most expensive of the 3, so you don't want to use it unless you have to. Potting mixes are what you would use if you were going to grow something shockingly in a pot. They'll have coconut coir or peat moss in them to help with water retention. If you've got something in a raised pot, it will dry out a lot faster than ground soil will. Most also have fertilizers in them to start off with, so for the first year you probably won't need to fertilize for most plants, especially if you're using larger pots. And a lot of seeds, especially larger ones, will grow perfectly fine in potting mix. You don't need to do the seed starting mix even if you are starting indoors, although I do recommend it. This stuff is usually what I'll up pot into once the babies have gone to middle school age and they're big enough. That's what I'll up pot into. It has a lot more nutrients in it and it will help them start to thrive. Compost is the cheapest of the three. It's usually very stinky because it's made primarily of manure, but it's very good at improving soil structure and adding nutrients to damaged soils. It's usually what you'd mix into your garden beds a little bit before you're ready to start to plant. I try and give it a week or two to settle in before I actually plant in it. Ideally, you'd put it in the fall, cover it with some mulch and let it percolate all winter long with your existing soil. That being said, unless it's literally fresh steer manure, you can probably incorporate it into your garden and plant into the stuff right away. It might be a bit smelly, but you can do it. I have done it. The main difference I would say is that compost should be an addition to your garden. It's not the prime source of bedding for your plants. You'll only need an inch or two of compost mixed in with your existing soil, unless it's horrendous, to get it up to snuff. So a quick recap there, we're in zone 8. You can grow pretty much anything that's not tropical. Your plants will need drainage, an acceptable microclimate for the seed type, and a growing medium. That's pretty much it. If you're starting inside, use seed starter mix. If you're growing in containers, use potting soil. If you're outside in a garden bed, put in compost. One other point is you can get your ground soil tested for pH as well as things like heavy metals. In fact, it's a good idea if you suspect your area was ever industrial. Here in Vic West, there is a lot of old industrial sites. Most people probably won't need to worry about that, but if you are really worried, you can use containers for the first year while you're getting that investigated. Again, on the info sheet, I believe there is a place for soil testing in Victoria that you can get that done. So you have your list, you've honed it down to what you think might be possible in the area that you have defined. You have a collection of seeds, and if you don't, then again, I have the resources list where you can probably source some of that stuff out. Step 3 is the fun part. You get to get started. I'm just gonna have a drink because I'm thirsty. Okay, so you basically need 5 things to start growing your own food, something to plant in. It can be pots, something like this. It can also be old ice cream containers. It can be the ground. It doesn't really matter, just something to hold the soil. You need your seeds or starts, and I'm going to talk about the 2 options there in a moment. Somewhere with sun and water, anywhere from a windowsill to 2,000 square foot backyard. Although I wouldn't suggest jumping right into 2,000 square feet because that's going to be a lot of work for you, especially if you're not quite sure what you're doing. You need the growing medium, even if it's in the garden. As I said, you might need to add some compost, but you might not. And a little bit of time, which will obviously depend on whether you're using a planter or raised beds or 2,000 square feet. So getting back to seeds or starts, this is where a lot of people are like, I don't even know where to start. Do I get seeds or do I use starts? The basic breakdown is seeds will be cheaper in the long term, but they're more labor intensive because you're doing the work that somebody who's started the start is doing for you. And you have to be okay with a higher failure rate. If you want to grow from seed, you have 2 options, indoors and direct seeding, which just means putting the seeds directly into the ground or pot wherever they're going to live for the season. If you're starting your own seeds indoors with optimal conditions and few hazards like no squirrels or birds or rain, it means you're more likely to get an actual plant from an individual seed. Each seed will have a certain germination rate. You'll see it on the packets. It will say something like germination rate 98% for these cucumbers, which is very good for a cucumber, I have to say. Some things will have as low as a 50% germination rate, which means if you want to guarantee one plant, you're going to have to put in at least 2 seeds to make that happen. It also gives you a head start on the season. So when it's cold and rainy in February, you can start planting stuff inside and be putting it outside when somebody else is just direct seeding it at that point. So you'll be 6 to 8 weeks ahead of the game if you do it that way. It can be intimidating for some people to start seeds indoors. I know I was terrified before I went to school and learned how to do it, but it's pretty simple. You just need about a meter of space. About this much space would be perfect for a 72-inch tray, and you can get 72 cells in that. Some kind of tray, the seeds, and some kind of container to put it in. You can use the insides of toilet rolls. It's a very popular way to do it. If you are going to use these, I would suggest that you don't just put this right in the ground outside, because these don't break down that fast and it will impede the roots slightly. So you just pop them out the same way you would from a plastic container, or just split them open before you transplant them. And your seed starter mix. So if you have a nice windowsill, the total cost of that is about $10. If you want to get all fancy and add a UV bulb, then another $15 and you can get away with that. You can also buy sets from places like Lee Valley that'll have a tray and a light and everything all set up for you, which is great, but they do run at about $150, so it's a bit more of an investment. The last thing you need to do if you are going to grow seeds indoors is transition them to the outside. It's called hardening off, and you'll hear people talking about it a lot in forums. It's a big bad world out there, and unless you're growing exclusively indoors, which you can do for some things, especially like microgreens, it's definitely something you need to do, but it is another investment in time. Starting seeds outside with all of those aforementioned hazards of squirrels and rain and Lord knows what else can be a trying experience, and it can waste time in short growing seasons, especially if you don't realize, for example, that the beans you planted 10 days ago haven't sprouted, not because there was something wrong with the seeds, but because a bird ate them 9 days ago, which has happened to me several times. Starts, on the other hand, are just baby plants that somebody has already started from seed for you. They're usually 1 to 3 months old, depending on the plant when you get them. And for many plants, they are past the hardest part of their life. But you can't always be 100% sure they've been grown organically or are disease-free if you haven't started them yourself. Some plants also don't like being transplanted, like squash, sunflowers, and dill, and direct seeding is actually better for the overall health of the plant. Purchasing starts is sometimes essential if, like me, you've missed a window of starting your peppers 6 weeks ago. Somebody's already done it for you and you can still have peppers this year. Or you have limited space or no facilities. And also the plants should be ready to plant outside at the time they're being sold. So a lot of the early guesswork of when to do what has been removed for you. Sometimes they'll come with useful information as well. If you're getting them from local growers in Victoria like Mason Street Farms or the Victoria Compost Centre, you can ask the person who actually started them how big they'll be, what will give them the best chance of success. Chances are they've been growing that variety for a long time and they'll know a lot more about it than the back of a seed packet. You might also only want like 2 tomato plants, and 2 different types of tomato plants at that, a cherry and a regular. At this rate, the cost of difference is minimal between buying 2 starts or buying 2 packets of seeds, and you probably don't need 50 tomato seeds, which is what you'll get in a packet. So you know that's a big advantage as well. You can just know that you have the start already. Both options are way cheaper than buying organic tomatoes every week in the store, and they also taste so much better in my opinion. Not to mention that I think growing food is one of the cheapest forms of therapy available. That being said, pretty much everything can be direct seeded into the garden. That's how nature intended it after all. But the timing is more important. Different seeds will have different cold tolerances. Some things just won't germinate unless the soil is above 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 20 degrees Celsius. And remember that if a tomato plant puts out thousands of seeds to replicate itself and you direct seed 2 seeds, you might not get a 100% success rate. You might, but you might not. On average, you'll use more seed putting it straight in outside with direct seeding than you will starting them indoors. If you're going to get started now and have access to seeds or starts, it's a great time. The nighttime temperatures are hovering from 8 to 10 degrees here in Victoria, which is approaching peak hour for things to germinate. Seeds you can put in the ground right now are pretty much all the leafy greens, kale, lettuce, mustards. The radishes, carrots, and beets can also go in. Pretty much anything that isn't a heat hog is fine right now. Heat hogs are things like beans, squash, cucumbers. Any of those guys will not like the weather at the moment and they shouldn't go in until mid to late May. Even tomato starts can go outside right now. I hardened mine off about 2 weeks ago. They've been outside, up against the wall. They get a nice bit of reflected heat there and they've been fine for 2 weeks outside at the moment. One thing I should probably mention is hardening off. I've mentioned it a few times. Basically, I just want to clarify what that means in case you're not sure. And it might also be necessary even if you buy starts at the moment. So imagine I arrive from Australia in December in my flip-flops and I wind up in Quebec. That is what your plants are going to feel like if you take them from your bedroom where you've started them under grow light and whack them outside right now. You need to gradually introduce them to the great outdoors to let them acclimatize. It'll take 7 to 10 days of ever-increasing exposure for them to be ready to go to their permanent homes. So that's kind of the basics. To review it, like think about what you want to eat, think about how much space you have and what conditions you have wherever you are. Then what resources do you have? And I'd like to reiterate, you do not need to spend a lot of money on this. Old containers, old salad containers, old pots you might have, make sure they're cleaned out, but you can use pretty much anything with a drainage hole. Seed exchanges, you can get a lot of seeds for free, and there's a lot of online resources. The main thing you would probably need to invest in upfront, if nothing else, is some potting mix or compost. That would be the main thing. The most important thing is don't be afraid. Just give it a go. And remember, not everything will live, but nothing will if you don't try. And those seeds will just die on a shelf, and that would be very sad. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'll be posting those resources sheet, as I mentioned, the next day or so. And I'm going to check in with Linda and see if we have any questions submitted. I do have a few that were submitted earlier as well that I'm going to address, but we've still got about 20-25 minutes to go through questions. So, Linda, do we have anything to go through right now?
There's one question. It's a bit more specific, not so much about backyard gardening.
Okay.
So I don't know, but it does.
I can give it a whirl.
It does relate to your homeland. So Crystal is wondering. She's thinking about buying a lemon or lime tree for an indoor pot, and she's wondering about what she should consider for indoor citrus.
Indoor citrus, yes. Lemons and limes do actually grow not badly here. I said, depending on your climate, I have seen them grow even outside in yards. They do like the heat though, so you'd have to bring them in winter would be the most important thing because they would get cold. If you have a greenhouse, they would probably grow quite happily. Again, they'd still get cold in the winter. You'd need to bring them in. With regards to considerations, I would make sure the pot's big enough for the plant. Most things, if you look at how big a lemon or a lime tree is supposed to be in its natural form, even dwarf versions are quite big. And a problem you may have is that running out of nutrients, because I mean, the lemon lime tree I had in Australia was about 9 foot tall and 5 foot wide, which is excessive, I know, even for a lemon tree. But it liked the heat. So make sure it's not near any drafty doorways, and make sure it doesn't get pot bound would be the major things I'd probably think about there.
Great. Another question about tomatoes this time. How far apart, Teresa and John want to know, how far apart do tomatoes need to be? 24 to 36 inches seems like a lot.
Depends on the type of tomato, quite honestly, and how big you want it to grow. Tomatoes are kind of one of those things that will grow into the space you allow. I grew some on my patio in Vancouver, and I had one of those little tiny planter boxes that's about 1.5 feet long and 1/2 foot deep. And I got a little tiny cherry tomato plant out of it. That same variety of cherry tomato I had at my community garden, and it was 9 foot tall and 3 foot wide. So it will, to an extent, grow to whatever you let it. One of the main reasons, if you have the space to space them out, is that you don't want any diseases to be able to jump easily from one to the other. And tomatoes are particularly susceptible. If their leaves get wet, they will rot. And that can get passed from one plant to another. So it's important to space them out from an air perspective. It's also why people prune their tomatoes quite a lot in BC because of the rain. You don't want the leaves getting and staying wet. If you are watering them, again, try and water them without getting the leaves wet at all. That's why drip irrigation is great for tomatoes. Tomatoes are happiest in a warm environment with a lot of water and very little rain actually on their tops, which I know is ironic because in Mother Nature they would have rain on their tops. But the spacing recommendations are for the health of the plant, not necessarily, and for its maximizing its fruit production, which is what you're looking for, which from Mother Nature's perspective, it's not so bothered about whether it produces 30 pounds of tomatoes for you. You might be bothered about that, but if a whole bunch of them rot because they're spaced too close together, that's going to be a problem. So that's kind of where that comes from, I think. The plants will grow, like if you take a tomato and leave it in the ground and it sends up a couple of hundred little baby tomato plants, those tomato plants will all grow, but the chances of infection and of them not reaching their full potential is greater if they're all squashed together.
We've got some great questions coming in now, so we're just going to go rapid fire here.
Go for it.
I have an area that is shallow soil. Can you recommend some veggies to start? It's 3 to 5 inches in depth.
3 to 5 inches. That's actually not bad. I mean, that's the size of the planters that I had on my patio. Apart from really deep-rooted vegetables, there isn't a lot you can't grow, really. Onions, shockingly enough, which I didn't realize until the last couple of years, do not like deep soil. They basically sit on top of the soil, like they grow out of the soil, and that's how they're happiest. You need like a couple of inches of soil for an onion. Garlic also only, I mean, the bulb is below the soil about that far, and it's that big. Couple of inches is fine for that. Any of the lettuce family will grow happily in any kind of planter. Radishes also, even if you get the long French style, they're still only a couple of inches long. So if the soil is double as deep as that, again, they're happy. The main problem with the smaller containers is they will dry out a lot faster than like deep soil or deep buckets. So you have to just make sure that you stay on top of the watering, and also as plants grow, they will suck the nutrients out of that potting mix. So you have to make sure that you do put fertilizer on in those circumstances or replenish it somehow, because as you plant things and as they grow, because they're getting no kind of infiltration from worms and other things going through and pumping up the soil, that will be the biggest problem. But there isn't too much, unless you're trying to grow foot-long carrots, there isn't really too much you can't grow in those conditions, or anything that's very top-heavy that's going to pull it over if it's a small planter. Was it a planter, or was it just very shallow soil?
Shallow soil.
Just shallow soil? Yes, if it's shallow soil, it's not going to get even pulled over. But so long as the roots aren't going to be, you don't want anything coming within about probably an inch or so of the bottom. But there's a lot of shorter varieties of carrots that you can get as well, little stumpy ones, a couple of inches long. Daikon radishes that grow to be this deep. That's probably about the only thing I can think of that you probably couldn't grow in there.
That's great. Okay, I found packs of basil and other seeds have expired by 2 years. Do seeds really expire?
Well, yeah, some do. And onion seeds are the classic ones that literally will probably last about a year. Most seeds will have a shelf life of about 3 years as like almost a guarantee. The best thing to do if you're not sure is don't throw them away. If you've got like packets of seeds and you don't know if they're going to work, take like 4 or 5 of them, put them on a wet paper towel for a couple of days in a nice warm spot in the kitchen. If they sprout, they're viable. If you put 5 of them out and none of them sprout, chances are they're probably not viable anymore. But it depends on how they were stored, where they were stored, and how old they are. I mean, some plants have seeds that remain viable in the ground for 10 years before they sprout. So especially some of the larger trees. So I would never say a seed is completely unviable. It could have dried out and died. That does happen. But the best thing is just to test them. If you've got a couple of them, just stick them instead on a paper towel and wait for a couple of days. If a little sprout comes out of even one of them, you're good to go.
Okay, there are some, I don't know if people can hear my questions. You might want to repeat it.
Oh, okay.
After I say I'm not sure.
Okay, can anyone put a thing up now and say it? Julie, could you hear the
tell us
questions?
if you can hear me. But there's a couple of questions about raised beds that I'm going to try and group together.
Okay.
So one is they'd like to build a raised bed. And she wants to know, can I just lay cardboard over the tiles and add good soil? Or do you need to dig up the pavers first?
Oh, you have pavers? No, not necessarily. I mean, as I said, the rooftop garden in Vancouver that I grew in was a rooftop, so you couldn't dig into it or there'd be a hole in the roof. So it's totally fine. Ideally, for most plants, you would probably want at least a foot of soil. As I know the last person said they had a couple of inches, and that is okay, but it's certainly not ideal for most plants. So, but putting raised beds on top of pavers is totally fine. The deeper the bed is, the less you'll have to worry about things like water seeping out the bottom and going all over your pavers. Like we had, how high were our beds at the community garden? They were about 3 or 4 feet high. That amount of soil in a bed, most of it's either going to evaporate or get used by the plants and never actually leak out the bottom. So if you only have like 16 inches, if you're just putting boards up or bricks and making a bed out of that, some water may leach out the bottom onto your pavers. I don't know if that's an issue for you at all, but there's no problem with actually growing on them. In fact, it will help heat up the soil from below. Those pavers will heat up, and the soil will heat up a lot faster than ground soil would.
Great. So there's another question about the depth of raised beds. So my son built some backyard garden boxes about 15 inches by 4 inches by 3 inches high.
3 inches high. Okay,
are the boxes too high? How deep does the base have to be? And they can hear me.
So it's only 3 inches high, the bed?
That's what it says.
3 inches is not very high for a bed. If it's on top of soil, it's not such a big deal because ultimately the plants will work their way down into whatever soil you have it on top of. If it's on something like a paver, 3 inches is probably not a lot to grow anything other than greens in. You could probably still grow lettuces and stuff like that in it. Ideally, I think the shallowest beds that I had that were actually on sort of a semi-permanent substrate were about 10 inches. So just under a foot. That was enough soil to grow quite a lot of things in. The ones, there's one community garden, they were 3 foot deep, and you could grow whatever you liked in those, like pretty much everything grew in them. But yeah, anything in between that is fine. You can also make them higher from accessibility standpoint. That's one of the great things about raised beds. If you want to stand up one, you can make them 4 foot high, and then you don't have to bend over to do anything as well. But there's not really an ideal, but I would say 3 inches is probably not enough soil.
3 feet.
Oh, 3 feet.
Sorry,
that
was a correction.
Okay, 3 feet. Yeah, you're good. 3 feet. No, that's great. Most plants will love that. Yeah, 3 feet's a great amount of soil to have.
3 feet. That was my mistake.
3 inches was very short.
That was my mistake.
Okay, that was her fault. Not your fault. Go ahead.
And then there's a question about what should you plant in garden beds?
What shouldn't you plant in garden beds, really? You can plant whatever you like. Again, think about what you want to eat.
If you had a new raised bed,
A new raised
and you're
bed.
starting from scratch, what would you put in there?
I would put what I want to eat in there. I would
Okay.
just think about what I want to eat and I'd put it in there. I would put in, personally, I would put in a potato plant. I'd put in some, well, garlic's in the winter, but ultimately these are all the things I'd have in there. I'd have a couple of rows of lettuce. I'd have a couple of rows of radishes in between my couple of rows of lettuces. So I got some salad action. I'd have a tomato plant in there and I'd probably have some peas. That's kind of a good basic mix, early, easy to grow stuff that's going to keep you happy. You can pick your pea pods, you can pick your cherry tomatoes and your lettuce and have a salad.
That's great. Do you have other more content that you want to walk through, or should I keep going with the
No,
questions?
the questions are good. I do have these questions from Karen that I should address here because she did take the trouble to send them in earlier. So her question was, what leaf lettuce or cherry tomato varieties would I recommend for growing here in Vic West? It's fairly specific, but I mean, I've only been here 18 months, and last year we didn't have our whole garden set up. But there's a few of the favorites I had from Vancouver. Two cherry varieties, one called Sweet Million, and another one called Gardener's Delight. I got them both from West Coast Seeds. And West Coast Seeds are sold by quite a few operators here in Victoria. So even if West Coast Seeds themselves can't send them to you, you might be able to find them there. I checked my records because I was doing it for a business company, an organization. I was keeping records of everything. And from 4 plants, from those little cherry tomatoes, I got about 20 pounds of tomatoes. So they were pretty prolific. Another one was a Roma tomato that I had that was called Juliet. And I got 30 pounds off 5 plants from those. So they were pretty prolific ones. With regards to greens, I tend to grow different leaf lettuce every year because I like to try different ones. One of the more reliable ones that we have here, it's called Fast and Furious, and for that very reason I like it. You stick it in any kind of planter, and within a month you'll have the sort of cut and come again lettuce, they call it. So you have a planter, you can just cut a few inches off when you want a salad, leave that part, it will regrow, and then you can cut another part the next time, and then it will regrow, and then you can cut another part and it will regrow. So it's really great for sort of salad mixes, that kind of stuff. They're 2 of my favorites. There was another one I had here. What was the one I was planting this year? I can't remember what it was called. I will put it on my list of things though, but I do have another lettuce that I just started. It's a type of cos lettuce. I can't remember the exact variety, but I started growing it this year and it's going great guns in my yard right now.
Great. So there's someone who wants some tips about peppers. She said she's tried pots on a balcony with morning sun,
Mm-hmm.
in her community garden with all day sun,
Mm-hmm.
and in a greenhouse. And she wants to know if you have any tips or whether peppers are just,
I'm assuming based on that it's not working very well in those 3 environments.
Can't seem to grow peppers here.
You know what? Peppers do like it hot. There's a few plants that like it very hot. Basil is one of them. Peppers. Tomatoes like it warm, but I wouldn't say they like it quite as baking as peppers do. Again, they do grow here. I have a friend who grows them in his greenhouse here every year. They're not as prolific as they will be somewhere like California. I don't actually think it's just hot enough unless you have a heated greenhouse or a very south-facing exposure that gets a lot of sun. They don't tend to germinate very easily. They take a long time to germinate. I started 6 this year and 1 survived. And the germination rate technically on the packet was 75%. So it was way below, even with a heat mat, even with all those things. Just didn't work out. I'm planning on buying some starts this weekend, I'm not going to lie. But I do think they do like it. To get past that initial stage, they do need a lot of work. And don't be surprised if they don't work. Let's say if you have a greenhouse, I don't see why they shouldn't work. I would just put them in the sunniest spot possible and make sure they keep getting enough water. But yeah, they do seem to like heat more than almost any other plant that I've ever tried to grow.
Wonderful. Okay, a couple questions about, I don't know what you would call them, pests. So there's
They could be pests.
So there's a question about aphids.
Oh.
So my kale plants always get covered with aphids midsummer. How can I discourage or remove these bugs? Well. And then there's a second question about slugs. My plants are getting devoured by slugs. What's the best way to keep them at bay?
Oh, the slugs and the aphids. My 2 favorites. Okay. So aphids are an issue, and with kale in particular, they do seem to love it. The main thing I would say there is, I mean, if you're looking at, like you have, say, I have 12 kale plants in my yard. You can buy insecticidal soaps and a whole bunch of other things. Honestly, I just squash them and blow them off with a hose. It's disgusting, don't get me wrong, but it's by far the fastest, and you get some grim satisfaction by just squashing them, quite frankly, and then blowing them off with a hose. Make sure the plants are at least a foot apart, because depending on the type of kale, most of the kale will sort of grow sideways. If their leaves are touching, those aphids can just jump from one to the other far too quickly. The further apart they are, the less aphids you'll wind up having. Also, take off the lowest, oldest leaves first, Again, that will prevent sort of, the infestations that you tend to get. And lastly, one thing I've done the last couple of years is planted nasturtiums all around the outside. A, they look really pretty. B, the aphids love them and they kind of take it for the team. They will suck probably, they won't suck all the aphids off your kale, don't get me wrong, but when you check out those poor little nasturtium plants, they will be covered in aphids and they'll still be looking pretty while doing it. And your kale will have, a couple of random aphids that you can easily get rid of when you wash your greens off, and they won't damage the plant at all. So that's what I've been doing. And yes, the poor nasturtiums, I plant them all over my garden to take the aphids away. They're my favorite aphid repellent, and then I squash them. As for slugs, touch wood, we don't seem to have that many here, but we did have them at the rooftop garden. Honestly, the best way to get rid of those was to send the little children into the yard and they would take them off and squash them with great glee, which is not going to be an option for everyone, I grant you. But they tend to come out first thing in the morning. They don't like the heat at all. So they'll accumulate in like moist areas overnight. As soon as daylight hits, they'll go scuttling for cover. So if you want to be able to find out how many you have, go out in early dewy mornings and you'll see them on everything, eating your lettuce, eating your kale, eating everything. Pluck them off and squash them. That's the easiest way, again, unless you have an acre of lettuce plants. I know some people also put out beer traps because apparently, like me, they divert towards the beer quite rapidly. So they will do that. That will suck a lot of them off your plants. But the easiest thing, honestly, is to go out every couple of mornings before about 8 o'clock when the sun gets too warm and just take them off and destroy them. If you've just got a small plot, that's going to be the easiest way to get rid of them.
Wonderful. Okay, so now there's a question about potatoes.
Oh, I love potatoes.
So someone is planning to, just trying to scroll up to the comments.
Yeah.
Looking to grow potatoes in pots. Mm-hmm. What is your best suggestion for types and process?
All right. I had another question. One of the earlier questions was about potatoes as well, so hopefully that will tie in there. They're one of the easiest things to grow and relatively easy. You want to grow in a pot. Now, to say what kind of pot? Just a pot. So potatoes, the traditional way of growing them is in your field. You would dig a trench down about a foot, like you'd hoe it with your big tractor, and you'd put the potato in the bottom of the trench and just fill it lightly. Like, so your trench would still be this high and the potato would be at the bottom, just covered lightly with soil. As the potato grows, you would push in some of the soil from the sides and bury it. Potatoes are part of the tomato family. They will actually grow roots and out of their stems as they grow. So they actually don't mind being buried. In fact, that's how they produce more potatoes. So as they grow, you keep burying them and keep burying them. Assuming your pot is more than 1.5 feet deep, you could totally do that with a potato in a pot. Just put the potato in the bottom, depending on the size of the pot. If it's kind of one of those classic, I don't know what size pots they are, about 1.5 feet high and yay big, I wouldn't put more than 2 potatoes in there because they do become quite big plants in the end. And put, say, 2 potatoes in a pot that big at the bottom, cover them lightly with soil. When you see them start to sprout, cover them with soil again. They'll keep sprouting, you'll keep covering it with soil until ultimately the pot is full. The plant will then grow out the top of the pot and look like a great big leafy green thing. It'll send up some flowers sometimes as well. Once those greens start to die back, that's when you know that in all probability the potatoes are ready underneath. You can kind of cheat and stick your hand down and rummage around and see what you can feel. The newest potatoes will probably be at the top, the little, you call them new potatoes. You can pop them off and eat them as well. But yeah, just leave them in the pot to grow basically. You'll only get, depending on the size of your pot, the bigger your pot, the more potatoes you'll get because they'll just keep growing under the ground and sending out shoots that way. As for varieties, it does depend a little bit on how big the pot is. There was one variety I grew once. I didn't realize it was quite such a big Yukon Gold potato, and I literally grew one that was bigger than my head. So the plant had put all its energy into growing 3 potatoes, and I had 15 pounds of potatoes, but each one of them was 5 pounds each. I like sort of the little golden red ones and little gold ones and red ones that come to be about this size. They seem to grow pretty prolifically. A lot of them are sort of immune to a lot of pest diseases that potatoes can get. You don't want a potato blight in your own backyard for sure. They like to be moist but not wet again. Everything kind of, most plants like to dry out a little bit. So you don't have to keep things permanently wet. About 1 inch of water a week is what most plants will need to grow effectively.
Here's a great creative question. Will kitchen scraps grown in glass jars that have roots grow in the garden?
Usually, yes. Again, it depends on I know there's a big craze of taking like the bottom of your celery, sticking it in water, and it will grow back a celery. I have taken like scallions, little like green onions. When I chop them up, I keep the bottom root part, and I will replant it in my yard every year and grow new scallions out of it. My concern would be with some plants, so long as they're producing roots, there's no reason why they shouldn't grow in your yard. They may have some issues with regards to sort of the equivalent of hardening off. If they've been inside in a protected environment for a while and then you whack them outside, they might die. But if you have a greenhouse or a protected spot inside that you can grow them, I don't see any reason why not.
Great. We still have some questions coming in. We still have 46 people with us, so let's keep going.
Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes left.
So besides tomatoes, what other plants don't like to get their leaves wet? I don't have drip irrigation, so this would be good to know.
Tomatoes are probably the most picky about that. Most plants, I mean, let's face it, things that are made to grow outside, which all plants originally were, have to cope with some level of moisture. Just that tomatoes hate it more than most. You can get tomato leaves wet, don't get me wrong. I just planted mine today and got them all wet. But if you water in the mornings, that water is going to have time to evaporate and dry off, and they're not going to sit wet all day. What you don't want is things to sit wet all day, every day, day after day. That's when they're going to rot. But yeah, I mean, everything else that I don't have drip irrigation either here. I had it at the rooftop garden, and what I noticed was the plants were just happier. So it's kind of like the pH issue with the soil. It's not that they won't grow that way. You'll just get less pathogens and less problems with your plants if the leaves don't get wet. Another one that really doesn't like its leaves getting wet are carrots. They hate it. Kale couldn't care less, and neither could Swiss chard, quite frankly. You could drown it every day and it will probably be fine. But yeah, the two that pop to mind right away that really don't like their tops getting wet are, and actually basil. Basil, carrots, and tomatoes are the ones that I can think of that really don't like it for the most part.
Great. And there's a follow-up on your tomatoes conversation. Mm-hmm. So if you put tomatoes in your garden with lots of space in between, should you provide some wire or structure for them to have as support as they get larger?
Yeah, again, it depends on the type of tomato. Some of them, there's two different varieties of tomatoes. So there's, some people will call them vining or indeterminate, and then there's bush or determinate. So they're two kind of categories of tomatoes. Bush determinate ones are, generally speaking, shorter, stubbier tomatoes. They grow into more like little bushes than great big vining things that you're probably more used to seeing as a tomato. Those particular varieties will set all their fruit at once, and you'll get one hit. So it's great if you want to make a lot of pasta sauce, for example, but not great if you want continuous harvesting throughout the season. They will be shorter though, because they're determinate. They grow to a certain point and then they just stop. Vining tomatoes or indeterminate tomatoes will keep growing throughout the season. So it's not that determinate tomatoes are not vines. They are. They just die a lot sooner. Once they've done their job, they're out of there. Whereas the vining indeterminate tomatoes will keep growing throughout the year. As it gets warmer, they'll keep producing shoots. They can grow to be 7, 8, 9 foot tall. I had them going out the top of my greenhouse, around the top, over the thing. So it does depend on the variety. The bush ones, I have had them growing quite happily. The plant itself doesn't need any support. But if it's a relatively large type of tomato that's a bush tomato, they can become quite heavy and break the stems. So you're not really supporting the plant itself, you're supporting the fruit, so that it doesn't break off before it's ripe and split the stems and damage the plant. So yeah, most tomatoes require some kind of support. The vining ones definitely require a lot more than the bush ones. The bush ones can live quite happily until their fruit is set without any support whatsoever. But if you want them, as said, to not split, you're probably going to want to put some kind of supports up there for them.
Is that the same for other things? Like what else would you need to support?
Squash, depending on the type of squash you have and where you're growing it. I mean, squash is a vine as well, so it's actually a great thing to grow vertically if you have limited space, because a lot of people are scared of squash because they'll go sideways and take over their whole yard, which they will, but you can also make them go up and make little arches out of them and all kinds of stuff. Again, their fruit are very heavy. Getting them off the ground is a great thing to stop them rotting, actually, but you would need to support those. Cucumbers, anything that's a vine, peas and beans, anything that's going to climb up, unless in Mother Nature it would climb all over the ground, like it would just happily go sideways, and if it rotted it wouldn't care, it would be putting its seeds back into the soil. You don't want that because you want to eat those things, that fruit that it's growing. So yeah, anything that you can think of that's vining up, that's what you're going to want to support.
So you mentioned kale grown for too long in the same spot will develop a fungus in the
Mhm.
soil. Can
Mhm.
you elaborate? What is it? What will it negatively affect? And maybe you can talk a bit about like rotating things around.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a little beyond basics of backyard gardening, but I can certainly speak to it. So, kale is one of the easiest things to grow, and because of that, people tend to every year to stick it in and stick it. And if you have a small space, there's only so much you can do. Obviously, like you're going to be planting maybe in the same 4 square feet every year. That's fine. I'm not saying that it's impossible to grow kale under those circumstances. You just have to be aware of it. And if you're growing in small containers like that, maybe replace a portion of the soil with compost each year so that you're not having kale grown in the same soil year after year. The whole brassica family, of which kale is a part, will do this. They develop a fungus on their roots. It's not dangerous to a great many other plants, but if you grow it in the same spot year after year, it will kill any brassica after that point. So that's kales, cabbages, Brussels sprouts, broccolis, all those things that are really good for you. They all are part of the same family. They will all be affected by that thing. So you'll see farmers do what's called crop rotation to avoid that. So they will move, they'll have within their farm, they might have 4 fields, they'll grow kale in one farm, one plot this year, the next year they'll move it over one, and the carrots will go into that field. That'll give that soil a chance to rest so that fungus doesn't accumulate to the point in the soil that it's not impossible to get rid of, but you do have to then leave it kind of fallow for maybe 4 or 5 years for it to be able to take a brassica again. So, as I said, if you have a very small plot and you really want to grow kale every year, say it's 4 feet wide, you just plant it on one side one year and on the other side the next year and put in some fresh compost every year and mix it up, and it shouldn't be a huge issue. That being said, it did happen to us on the rooftop garden. We had limited space. The community, the transition house loved kale. We grew a lot of it. We did get root rot. It won't kill all of your plants, but it will definitely make them not as healthy moving on.
Wonderful. Okay,
We've got about 4 minutes left.
so
What do you
there's
got?
a couple of questions about irrigation and one about soil. So the question about soil is, what is the difference between potting soil and black earth?
Potting soil, as I said, it's a combination. It usually has things in it to retain the water. So coconut coir or things like that. It's to stop it draining so quickly. Black earth, I'm actually not 100% sure of what is actually mixed into it. It might just be soil without the amendments kind of thing. So it's going to be more similar to what may actually be in your garden to start off with. I think they use it a lot in landscaping, but I've never seen anyone use it actually in a garden. I'm not saying it hasn't been done. I've just never used it in a garden, in a food production garden per se. I've always used compost. So I'm not actually sure. I can look it up. I can find out and put it on the info sheet, but I don't really know what the main difference is. I would think it's probably the moisture retention things that they put in compost in potting soil.
Great. And then a new rookie gardener, self-described, wants to know what kind of irrigation systems do you recommend for a new install for a rookie gardener?
Kind of depends on how much space you have. If I was setting up a garden that had more than a couple of raised beds and I was concerned about things like leaf wilt and stuff like that from watering from above, I would definitely put in drip. There's a few different types of drip irrigation. It's very easy actually to put in, and there's a few different providers which I'll put on the resources sheet that can help you out with it. Mostly it's you snap it together, and the amount of water you use in drip irrigation is like something like 100 times less than using overhead irrigation because you're not having any evaporation issues. It's way better for your plants. The water's going straight to the roots. And basically everyone's happier. You're spending less on water, the environment's happier because you're not using so much water, and your plant is happier because the water's just going where it wants it to be, which is on its roots and not on its head. So yeah, I would definitely recommend drip irrigation if you have the funds. You can also use just soaker hoses. They work pretty well on the same principle. If you're going to get a soaker hose, I would get the type that you can actually bury. Again, it prevents a lot of evaporation. They use a bit more water than an actual drip hose. But, that being said, right now in my yard, I have a watering can and a rain barrel. So, anything can work. You just have to be a bit more careful if you're going to use those methods.
And then any tips for things to grow on a hot south-facing balcony? I've tried growing herbs, but they all get very bitter and seemed burnt.
Depends on how hot. I mean, I know some south-facing balconies can get scorching hot. Most herbs should actually enjoy that. A lot of them are Mediterranean by nature from origin. So things like sage and rosemary should like it. The leafier kind of things are not going to enjoy it. I would think basil would love that. Basil loves my greenhouse. It actually, like, the hotter it gets, the happier it seems to be. So I'd be surprised if basil didn't flourish in those kind of scenarios. And peppers, as we've already mentioned, love the heat, and tomatoes. The things that I would find would not be happy would be leafy green kind of things. Lettuces would not like it. Um, yeah, the cold weather crops, even kale, it might be too hot for. There is a list of shade tolerant plants on the thing I'm going to put out, and I have one for hot plants as well. I get more questions about shade ones in Victoria, shockingly, than hot ones, but I can find one for the heat loving plants as well and put those on there. And then you can check that out from there, because I think we're nearly out of time. Do you have one more?
One more. Let me just see. I think people are starting to say thank you. There's a construction question which you may or may not have an answer to, especially at this moment. But it says, where is the best place to buy a rectangle bracket for my rectangle pots? Do you have a sense of that right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think Castle Hardware actually has them. I have a funny feeling I saw them when I was down there last time. Castle Hardware, Home Depot. I'd be surprised if Garden Works didn't sell them, quite frankly. It is kind of something, the round ones are more common for sure, but I have seen the square ones. I've also MacGyvered one myself, but yeah, I would try somewhere like Castle Hardware. I've seen they have a lot of different gardening stuff in right now, and they may be the best option for you there. So I think we're pretty much out of time. Thank you all for coming. I know there's a couple of answers that we got in advance that I haven't addressed, but I can put those on the info sheet as well to get those addressed. If there's anything in particular that I haven't answered for you, you can always drop me a line on my Yard to Plate site. It's in Facebook. You can just type in Yard to Plate and it should pop up. And there'll be a picture of somebody who's dirty that looks something like me. I guess that's it.
Lots of great thank yous.
All right. Thanks all for coming. See you later.